Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Friendly Academy. My name is Manoj, and in this episode let's discuss about how to connect to a private API from EventBridge using the new VPC Lattice Resource Configuration. So as always, we are going to go through all the theoretical part, including how each component connect with each other, as well as we will discuss them in a demo. So you will have the crystal clear understanding how everything works end to end. Let's get started. When we are developing applications on AWS, particularly the event-driven architectures, we use EventBridge heavily. EventBridge is essentially a pub/sub service where you can send event to an EventBridge and then you can have multiple subscribers. So this enables many-to-many routing. So we can have like multiple producers. They can send events to this EventBridge EventBus, and then we can set rules. So these are the rules or patterns, and if these events match with these patterns, those consumers will receive these events. Now when we are using EventBridge, these consumers, we call them targets. So if they are matching with a particular rule, that event is sent to the target. Now these targets could be various things. That could be a Lambda function or SQS queue, now in this case an API gateway, or even third-party APIs. Now, say that you have a requirement that you need to connect to a private API. So what do I mean by private API? So in API gateway, we can create a REST API which is private. So that means it is not accessible from public internet. So if that's the case, until 2024 reInvent, we couldn't directly invoke a private API from EventBridge rule. So as a workaround, what most of us we did is that we have a Lambda function, and that Lambda function is in a VPC, and from within the Lambda function, we call our private API. Because when it comes to a Lambda function, we can run this Lambda function within a VPC, and then we can connect to the private API, and if this private API whitelists that particular VPC, then we can connect to it. But unfortunately, we couldn't connect to this API directly if this API is a private API. Now this is changed after 2024 reInvent because AWS introduced a way to connect to a private API using something called VPC Lattice service. So this VPC Lattice service is a networking service in AWS where you can connect resources in one or more VPCs. Now in VPC Lattice, we can create something called resource configuration, and then we'll ask EventBridge to create a connection to that resource configuration. So after EventBridge creates a connection to this VPC Lattice resource configuration, it has access to the VPC private resources. Now that EventBridge can access the VPC resources, we are going to create a VPC endpoint for our private API such that EventBridge can trigger that API with the events that matches with this event rule. Now I understand that I introduced a lot of terms and new services in the last couple minutes, but let me do a quick demo on AWS console so that this is crystal clear to you. I go to AWS console. So let's go ahead and first create our API gateway, and we'll create a private API. So I'll go to API gateway and I'm going to create a API. So we have multiple options: HTTP, WebSocket, REST API, and the REST API private. So this is the one that we are going to create. So I go ahead and click build here, and let's create a new API, and I will give it a name, mjson private API. Endpoint type is private. Can you see this information here? Private APIs are only accessible through VPC endpoints for API gateway. So if we wanted to access this API, we have to use a VPC endpoint. And let's go ahead and create the API. And in this API, I'm going to go ahead and create a resource. Resource is test resource. Create resource. And I will create a method for this resource. Let's go ahead and create a post HTTP method, because you see now when we are sending something to an API, we probably use a post endpoint, right? Because we want to send some data from EventBridge, whatever the events that match with the rule. So I'll go ahead and create a post, and behind that we have, let's say, Lambda function. I will enable Lambda proxy integration. So all the event detail will be sent to the Lambda. Now we can link our Lambda function. So I will open AWS Lambda console in a different tab and create a function, author from scratch, mjson, give it a name. I'll use the latest runtime. I just create the function. Function is created, and this is the code, the boilerplate code. Index.js, it just says hello from Lambda, and this is good. And let's link this Lambda. I will go back to my previous tab. Here I can either do a full refresh, or I can use the Lambda ARN that I just created. This is that function ARN. Let me copy that one and then paste it here. And then I'm going to create the method. So it's created. Now here if you go to post, there you go. Our request will be sent to the AWS Lambda, the function that we just created. This function is going to send this response. I will do a console log here in the function code, console.log, hello from Lambda here. So we can see that in the AWS CloudWatch logs. Left side, I will deploy the changes. Okay, it's deploying. All good. Now, if you all can remember that previous information, we have to create a VPC endpoint to access this API because this is a private API. Now, even if we create a VPC endpoint, we have to allow that VPC endpoint to access our private API. How do we do that? We do that using a resource policy. Now, the resource policy is attached to the API gateway. So let's click here. There are no resource policies right now. I'm going to go ahead and create a resource policy. I will choose one of these templates. So here we have this source VPC allow list. I'm going to choose that. So that will populate some sample resource policy. So it says it's going to deny any request to this API. See, this is the deny if it is not initiated from the given VPC. Now, rather than whitelisting the entire VPC, we are going to whitelist only that VPC endpoint so that we can have more control over the VPC endpoint, such as we can have a security group added to the VPC endpoint, so on and so forth. So how are we going to change that? Here we will include E. It is AWS source VPC E for endpoint, source VPC endpoint, and here we will add that VPC endpoint ID. But we haven't created the VPC endpoint yet, so I will leave this page open and then I will search for VPC, right click, open in a new tab. So here in my AWS account, I have few VPCs. So for this demo, I'm going to use this my VPC, this one. So if I select this, I will go to resource map. Here you can see, so this VPC, my VPC, it has 4 subnets, 1, 2, 3, 4. Out of these 4, 2 are public subnet. That means they have a route out to internet gateway. Can you see both public VPC, public subnet 1 and public subnet 2? They are calling the same route table, AC public RT, and this has access to internet gateway. But if you think about private subnet 4 and 3, this is connecting to a private route table and it doesn't have access to internet gateway. So this is my VPC and I'm going to create a VPC endpoint in this VPC. So what essentially is a VPC endpoint? So if you have VPC, so say that this is the VPC, we can create a VPC endpoint. So this is the VPC endpoint, and we can create a interface VPC endpoint or a gateway VPC endpoint. Today we are going to use an interface VPC endpoint because for most of the AWS services, we can create VPC endpoints. In this case, our intention is to create a VPC endpoint for API gateway. A VPC endpoint, and it is connecting to our private API gateway, like so. And within our VPC, we are going to create the VPC endpoint, and in our private API gateway resource policy, we whitelist this VPC endpoint ID such that it can connect to this private API gateway. So let's go ahead and create that. In VPC dashboard, you can scroll down on your left side, there's this endpoints. Click on that. Right now I don't have any endpoints. So I'm going to go ahead and create an endpoint. I will call it API gateway endpoint. And I'm going to connect to a AWS service. So I'll select this one. And then I will search for execute API. So this is the service name. So this is the service name that we should use to connect to API gateway. com.amazon AWS UST1 is the region, execute API. So if I want to connect to a different service, you can search that service name such as step function and so on. Here I will select this one, and it's an interface endpoint. And then I have to select from where to put this VPC endpoint, which VPC. It is at my VPC. And make sure you enable DNS name, because we are going to use this DNS name when you are creating the VPC Lattice Resource Configuration. IPv4, and then I can select the subnets. So I will select my two private subnets. Use 1 AC1, use 1 AC2. There you go. So I can see it here as well, private 4 and private 3. And then I'll scroll down and I can select a security group. Now this is more of additional benefits with VPC endpoint. We can secure VPC endpoint with a security group. So let's use our default security group, FD5. So this is the default security group. I'm going to select that one. In addition to that, I can add more VPC endpoint policies. I'm not going to do any more fine tuning. I'm going to go ahead and create the endpoint. So my endpoint is getting created, but in the meantime, I know what my VPC endpoint ID is. Here I copy this and I go back to my API gateway resource policy. You see now we added that E at the end. So now I can replace this with VPC endpoint ID. There you go. So here, if you are not calling this API through the VPC endpoint, we are going to deny it. Now, in fact, I'm going to enable this condition to all my resources in my API. So let me add stars to this. And I will also allow it. So if I have the VPC endpoint, I will have an explicit allow any path of my API. That's that. And then I'm going to go ahead and save it. But before that, let me check if my VPC endpoint is created. It is available now. So I'll go ahead and click Save Changes. Okay. And then I can deploy this API. I'll click here. And then this is my API. I click deploy to a new stage. I don't know, I will call it dev deploy. So the API is deployed and this is my invoke URL. If I go to that post method and click on it, I should see that full endpoint URL. I should see that full invoke URL including that /test path. But look, if I try to go ahead and access it, I can't reach to it because this is a private API. This doesn't have any access from internet. Everything is cut off. Okay, now our plan is to create a EventBridge EventBus and send an event to it and then have a rule configured for that. So that rule, if that event matches with that rule, it should invoke this private API. So let's go back to our AWS console. I will search for EventBridge. So this is that EventBridge. By the way, if you want to know about EventBridge in more detail, I have a crash course for that. You can check that in this channel. I will also link it in this video description. So essentially EventBridge, there are many features. I'm going to use EventBridge EventBus. You can see on your left side, I can create an EventBus. Click here. I'm going to create a new EventBus. I have already created one, but I'm going to go ahead and create another one for the sake of completeness. Bus 2. That's it. I only give it a name and I will keep the defaults for stressed and go ahead and create it. So my EventBus 2 is created. So we have the EventBus now. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a rule. So let's go to rules. And this rule is for my EventBus 2. I'm going to go ahead and create a rule. I will call it my rule 1. So it's connected with my EventBus. And I'm going to create a rule with the event pattern. Click next. So when I'm creating an event rule, I have to define what's the source and what's the target. And then in between, I have to define the event pattern. So source is our EventBridge. So I'm going to select AWS events and sample event is optional thing. Here I can define my event pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and click the custom pattern. I can use the JSON editor. So here I will define the pattern for my event. So any event that has the source, I'll just call it my app, will be matched and then sent to the target. So when you are sending an event to this event bus, we have to include this source as my app. Then it will be matched with this event pattern. Okay. And I'm going to click next. So after that, I can define the target. So what's going to be my target? It's going to be AWS service, right? So essentially what we should do is we have to connect an API gateway. Let's see if that works. So I'm going to go ahead and type API gateway there and select the API. There are a bunch of APIs in my account, but I can use this API ID or mjson private API. So let's use this one, mjson-private API. I'll try to find it. It's not there. So if you look at this list, it only shows the public APIs. See, I don't see this mjson private API here. So therefore, you can see now we can't create a event rule targeting to a private API. Therefore, we have to use the second option, which is EventBridge API destination. So let me select this one. And here I have to create a new API destination. So let's select this one, create new API destination. I will call it mjson private API destination. That's the name. And here I have to enter the endpoint. So what's our endpoint? If we go to our API gateway, the post endpoint is this, right? So let me copy this. I will paste it here. Okay. And then HTTP method is a post method. So here we can limit the number of requests per second, like the throttling, but I'm not going to do that. And then here I have to create a connection. So this is the other important piece. So when we used API destination, we have to inform EventBridge on how to connect to that API destination. For example, like the authentication, authorization, is it O2, is it just username, password, is an API key, so on and so forth. We have like let EventBridge know how to connect to that API destination. Now, this is a private API, and that's the part where we need to use this VPC Lattice Resource Configuration. And this will tell us how to connect to that VPC and therefore access that VPC endpoint. Okay. So here in the connection configuration, I can select create a new connection. I'm going to say so the connection name is on private API connection. So this is the type. Now until 2024 reInvent, it was always public. But now we have this private. So it's marked as new. Maybe they will remove it next year or so. So I'm going to select this one, right? And after that, I have to select the resource configuration. You see, not sure if you guys can see it. It says private APIs are accessed through VPC Lattice. Select the VPC Lattice resource configuration for the private API. Now I don't have one of that yet. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and create a new resource configuration. Click here. That will open in a new tab while the other one is open in other side. So let's go ahead and create a resource configuration. We'll call it private API resource config. And I'm going to connect to a resource, and that resource is a VPC endpoint, because remember, we can connect to a private API only through a VPC endpoint. Now we have created a VPC endpoint, so our resource is going to be a VPC endpoint. So you see now this resource can be a DNS address, which is good, right? So because our VPC endpoint has a DNS address, so we are going to use that. So let me go to our VPC endpoint. And this is the endpoint that we created. Yeah, endpoint. You select this one. You should see the DNS names. Now there are a bunch of DNS names. Select the first one. And I will go back to my resource configuration type. So this type is a single, you see, a resource that is an IP address or a DNS address, because we have a DNS address of our VPC endpoint. And the protocol is TCP. And before I'm talking about this resource gateway, I will select this DNS record and I'm going to paste that DNS name that I just copied. Okay. Now I can't just save it because we skipped this part, resource gateway. So what is this? What is the resource gateway? If I open my diagram real quickly, so right now what I'm creating is a resource configuration using VPC Lattice. So once I create it, so I get access to my VPC, the one that I created, right? Which is VPC MJ Zone VPC. This is my VPC. Okay. So it has some connectivity to the VPC. Now this is happening through a resource gateway. There's another construct, I would call it, let's say resource gateway. So that will connect through a resource gateway, and this essentially has, as I remember, so this essentially has some ENIs, elastic network interfaces, that will connect to this VPC. Just to give you additional context, so when you create a VPC and create a VPC endpoint to a service, it's actually going to create an ENI, elastic network interface, that is connecting to this AWS resource. Similarly, there will be another ENI connecting to this VPC. So VPC is also another AWS service, right, for that particular customer. So through this ENI, resource gateway is able to access that VPC. Let's not go into that detail, but we need to create that resource gateway. So let's come here, and I don't have any resource gateway. I will click, there's another link that will open another tab. So I will create it. So I will call it my resource gateway. And the VPC that is connecting to is my VPC. And the subnets is remember that AZ1 is that private subnet, private 4, and AZ2, the other private subnet. Security group will use that default security group, okay? So that's easier. Because usually when we use default security group, there's a rule. If a resource has the same security group, it allows access to the other side. So we are going to use the same default security group here, and then go ahead and create the resource, or resource gateway rather. So it's created. And after that, I go back to my previous page where I have to select the resource gateway, refresh it. This is the one I just created. This is the one that I previously created before the demo. This is the resource gateway. And now our DNS is also ready. I think we are good here. Let me go all the way down and click create resource configuration. So we create the resource configuration and now it is created. Very well. So I go back to my other tab where now I can do a refresh here. I should ideally see my private API resource config. So this is the one I created. Let me select that one. And I haven't configured any authentication to my private API gateway. But let's say now we'll use API key because I had to choose one of these. And my API key is in X API key header. Let me type in a value test. So when EventBridge is calling our private API, that will include this X API key and this value. That should do, I think. Now let it create a new IAM role for this rule. And then I'll click next. Click next. So this is the event pattern. This is a summary. I just copy that one just so I can test it. And everything seems good. I'm going to go ahead and create the rule. Okay, rule is created and it is attached to my EventBus too. So it's time to test this. So let's see if it works. So if it works, the Lambda function behind our API gateway should have an invocation. This is our post method and it's going to call this Lambda function. I will open that. You see now it's connected with our private API. See? And what I would do is I will go to this monitor section and click open CloudWatch. So I can see any invocation logs here. So with that open in a different tab, I will go to my EventBridge and click Event Buses and select the event bus that I want to test. Select this and click send events. So this is the event bus I want to send an event. So this is the event bus. Event source is my app. Do you remember like we had a rule? If the event source is my app, then only it will match that rule. This can be anything really, anything. I'm not gonna add any message body, event body here. And then let's go ahead and send. See if that works. So event is sent successfully from EventBridge. So now it has to match with my event rule and call that private API. Let's see if we get any invocation. I'll go to the CloudWatch. So right now there are no any log groups created for this Lambda function, but if I reload it, let's see. Now I don't see any logs yet. All right, so now it shows up. Maybe it takes some time to propagate all these changes because there were like multiple connected components here, right? So what I did is I went ahead and redeploy my API gateway. So I went to the API and then I deployed it again. Choose the same stage and then deploy it. And after that, you can try sending another event. So you can go to EventBridge and then go to Event Buses again. Select the bus and send events. My app is the source name. Detail name could be anything. Just send, let's say, name Manoj. So this is the payload of the event. And additional configure, nothing to change. And then I'll send again. It's sent. Let me go to Lambda logs again. Monitor, Lambda logs. Let's open this one. Yeah, I see the latest invocation. So this is the one that started at this time. Okay, so it seems to be working. You guys can see it's hello from Lambda is printing. So it's able to call my Lambda function. So now EventBridge is able to connect to my API through this VPC Lattice Resource Configuration, which include the connection details to connect to my VPC. And there I use the VPC endpoint that connects to the API, private API. And the private API then call the Lambda function. Alright guys, I hope this is clear. I'll see you in another video.